We do not ask for permission to be free. We rise to claim it.
President Ibrahim Traore, Adosaba Summit 2025. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a moment, quiet, clear, and impossible to ignore. At precisely 6:30 a.m. on August 27th, in front of dozens of world leaders and hundreds of international journalists, President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso looked straight into the cameras and addressed Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with words rarely heard in modern diplomacy. You have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here. No applause followed, just silence, the kind that falls when something true has been said. Within minutes, clips of the speech spread across the world. Headlines debated it. Young people repeated it. But this story is not about outrage. It's about something deeper. It's about the quiet strength of a continent reclaiming its dignity. Because for too long, Africa has been spoken about not to. And now that silence has ended, if you still believe in justice, not for one country, but for all, stay with us. Because what you're about to hear will not appear in the evening news. The world didn't see it coming. Not because there were no signs, but because too many chose not to look. For months, a slow tension had been building beneath the surface of Africa's diplomatic circles. The trigger came quietly, not from a speech, but from a leak. Multiple diplomatic sources confirmed that during a closed-door G7 meeting earlier this year, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly made comments that deeply offended several African leaders. Among the most affected was Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traore, whose leadership had increasingly drawn international attention. According to those present, Netanyahu dismissed Africa's criticism of Israel's military operations as naive and referred to Traore and his counterparts as militantly theatrical. The remarks, while never officially released, sparked internal outrage. Even more concerning was Netanyahu's suggestion of supporting stricter IMF debt recovery efforts targeting African nations, a move some leaders interpreted as economic pressure disguised as reform. And then came the most troubling part. Netanyahu reportedly floated a new Western-sponsored geopolitical framework called the Great Reconstruction 2030 Pact, a proposal that, if true, would reshape development partnerships without African nations having a true seat at the table. When the leak became public, African media lit up. The phrase, "Africa is not your pawn," became a rallying cry online. But President Traore said nothing at first. His silence was not hesitation. It was strategy. He waited until the African Development Summit in Adosaba, a historic gathering meant to showcase Africa's progress and unity. That's where he stood, not just as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as a voice for something much larger, a continent that had too often been overlooked, misunderstood, or misrepresented. And in that moment, the Adosaba Summit stopped being a ceremonial gathering. It became something else entirely, the stage for a new standard of respect in international relations. What President Traore demanded wasn't confrontation. It was recognition, not of superiority, but of equality. Because the story of Africa is not one of constant need. It is one of constant contribution. And it is time the world heard that story, not filtered, not edited, but told by those who live it. There are moments in global politics when a single sentence redraws the map, not of borders, but of dignity. August 27th, 2025, Adosaba. The African Development Summit had entered its second day. Delegates were shuffling papers, journalists typing notes, the usual rhythm of international diplomacy humming along. And then, President Ibrahim Traore walked to the podium. No script, no teleprompter, just a flag behind him and a silence in the room that somehow felt louder than words. He adjusted the microphone, looked into the sea of faces, then directly into the live broadcast cameras, and said, "Mr. Netanyahu, Africa will not be your pawn. Not in diplomacy, not in trade, not in history. You have 48 hours to apologize to this continent, or You will no longer be welcome here. The room didn't erupt. It froze. Keyboards stopped mid-sentence. Delegates glanced around, unsure whether they were witnessing a diplomatic misstep or a turning point. Traore continued, calm, composed, not accusatory, but resolute. This is not a threat. This is a matter of principle. Africa is not a subject of debt chains, nor an experiment in geopolitical engineering. We will not be reshaped behind closed doors. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. By the time he stepped away from the microphone, the summit had transformed. What was scheduled as a panel on agricultural development now carried the gravity of a global standoff. And within minutes, the moment was everywhere. Clips of the speech went viral. Social media lit up across the continent and far beyond. In Johannesburg, Accra, and Lagos, young Africans posted the video with captions like, "Finally, someone said it." In Harlem and Kingston, members of the African diaspora began to share their own reflections, many saying it was the first time they had seen an African head of state speak that unapologetically on the global stage. But this wasn't just about one man standing up. It was about what he stood up for. At the heart of the ultimatum was a bigger question. What kind of respect does Africa deserve, not in theory, in practice, in policy, in partnership? Traore's challenge didn't come out of nowhere. His government had spent the last 2 years taking bold steps. Most leaders wouldn't dare attempt nationalizing gold mines, launching Burkina Faso's first gold refinery, distributing farming equipment to rural cooperatives, building schools, reopening textile factories, even rejecting IMF loans, all in the name of self-reliance. To many across Africa, his voice carried weight, not because of charisma alone, but because of follow-through. He didn't ask for applause. He asked for accountability. And the response? A tidal wave. South Africa's foreign minister reposted the clip writing, "A new standard for African diplomacy." Former diplomats in Kenya, Ghana, and Tanzania echoed similar support. Even opposition politicians, often critical of Traore's military background, found themselves aligning with his demand for respect. Yet, not all responses were public. Behind the scenes, diplomatic envoys began reaching out to African capitals. Quiet inquiries, cautious language, a phrase repeated often in backchannels clarifying misunderstandings. Israel's government issued a vague statement denying the leaked remarks, but it did not mention Traore's name, nor did it offer an apology. To some, that was an act of prudence. To many in Africa, it felt like dismissal. And here, the story took a deeper turn from drama to declaration. Because while the 48-hour deadline loomed, the ultimatum had already done something far more powerful than provoke a reaction. It had reframed the entire relationship between Africa and the world. No longer was Africa seen as the passive recipient of aid, of policy, of pre-written scripts. With one speech, Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation long overlooked in foreign policy headlines, had placed itself at the center of the global conversation, not by force, not by funding, but by standing still and speaking clearly. There were risks, of course: economic retaliation, political isolation, the whisper of sanctions from institutions where Africa still lacks majority influence. But there was also something else: momentum. From university campuses in Dakar to dusty village gatherings in central Burkina Faso, people weren't asking, "Was this too bold?" They were asking, "Why hasn't this happened sooner?" Because in a world increasingly defined by global partnerships, alliances, and strategic interests, Traore's question was refreshingly simple. If you speak to us, speak with respect. If you work with us, work as equals. And if you don't, then don't expect to remain welcome. This wasn't just about Netanyahu. It was about the idea that no nation, however powerful, has the right to treat others as less. And so, the countdown began. Not to conflict, but to clarity. By the time the sun set on that first day, the words of Ibrahim Traore had already leapt beyond Burkina Faso's borders. They were no longer just part of a political speech. They were becoming part of a larger awakening. On social media, the hashtag #HeekAfrica is not your pawn soared to the top of trending lists on X, TikTok, and Facebook. But it wasn't just the digital world responding. From high-rise conference rooms in Nairobi to classrooms in Cape Town, from markets in Bamako to diaspora communities in Harlem and Brixton, people were watching not just to see if Prime Minister Netanyahu would respond, but to understand what this moment really meant. For millions, this was not merely a diplomatic dispute. It was a rare moment when a sitting African president didn't hesitate, didn't hedge, didn't wait for international consensus. He spoke plainly, unapologetically, and on his own terms. And that clarity became contagious. In universities across Africa, students gathered for forums and debates. In Ghana, law students quoted Traore's ultimatum in policy discussions. In Nigeria, media studies programs analyzed the speech as a case study in post-colonial assertion. It became more than news. It became language, a shared reference point, in a continent that often feels divided by language history or geography. In the United States, something remarkable began to unfold. At historically Black colleges and universities, Howard Spelman Morehouse student groups organized discussions overnight, not just about the Israel-Africa dispute, but about the broader implications of African agency. Professors of African Studies and International Law opened their classes with Traore's speech. And something else happened: comparisons. To Dr. Martin Luther King's speech at Riverside Church, to Nelson Mandela's firm diplomacy, to Patrice Lumumba's final letter. Not because Traore was trying to become a legend, but because the moment reminded people of one simple truth. Dignity is timeless. Even in Washington, D.C., a quiet shift was underway. African American journalists and commentators, often left on the sidelines of foreign policy, were invited onto prime-time panels, not as cultural voices, but as geopolitical analysts. Their message was consistent. This isn't a tantrum. It's a tectonic shift. In Harlem, members of the African diaspora gathered in Marcus Garvey Park, holding handmade signs that read, "Africa doesn't beg. Africa remembers." And perhaps that's what made this moment so powerful. It didn't come from anger alone. It came from memory. Memory of the past decades where Africa was promised partnership, but often given conditions. Memory of summits where African leaders were present, but not heard. Memory of policies made about the continent, but not with it. This time, something was different. The voice was African, the demand was clear, and the world had to listen. But the impact wasn't only symbolic. In South Africa, lawmakers called for an immediate review of bilateral trade agreements with Israel. In Namibia and Tanzania, foreign ministries released statements affirming the right of all nations to demand dignity in diplomacy. In Kenya, student unions and civic organizations urged the African Union to adopt a common diplomatic position in defense of Burkina Faso. And then came the statements from places many didn't expect. From Christian and Muslim leaders in Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Ethiopia, united in their call for respect, not retaliation. From youth groups in Uganda and Rwanda who had never aligned politically before. Even from African artists and musicians who turned Traore's speech into music videos and spoken word performances. It wasn't just unity. It was recognition. Recognition that something had broken through the usual noise of politics and had become a message, not just to Israel, not just to the West, but to Africa itself. That message: you don't need permission to be respected. You don't need consensus to stand up, and you don't need to be a superpower to speak with clarity. Back in Burkina Faso, the effect was even more profound. In rural communities where conflict has long overshadowed hope, the president's words were repeated in churches, mosques, and village meetings. In makeshift refugee camps, displaced families passed the quote from person to person as if it were scripture: Africa will not be your pawn. And perhaps that's where the real truth emerged. Not in press releases or foreign policy journals, but in the quiet places. The places where dignity has often been denied and where hope has often felt far away. Those were the places where the ultimatum was no longer about Netanyahu. It wasn't even about Traore. It was about something bigger. A new generation realizing that they don't need to wait for permission to define their own future. And as the 48-hour clock continued ticking, it became increasingly clear. Whether or not an apology came, the power had already shifted, because once a people discover their voice, they don't give it back. By the second day, the question was no longer, will Netanyahu respond? It was, what if he doesn't? In Burkina Faso, public squares filled with people holding signs that read, Africa stands with Traore. Respect is the beginning of peace. This wasn't a coordinated government campaign. It wasn't orchestrated. It was spontaneous, driven by people who had spent generations watching others speak about Africa, finally witnessing someone speak for it. For many Burkinabe, the ultimatum struck a deep chord. Despite facing ongoing conflict, displacement, and economic strain, they stood behind their president not because everything was perfect, but because, for once, someone was standing up. Traore's approval ratings, already high, surged. Even critics of his military-led government fell quiet. The ultimatum wasn't just popular, it felt personal. It was, as one student in Ouagadougou put it, the first time in a long time that Africa didn't flinch. Across the continent, momentum built. In Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria, student unions issued joint statements urging the African Union to act if no apology came. Proposals ranged from suspending diplomatic ties to reviewing regional trade with any country that disregards African sovereignty. Even the African Union, often criticized for its cautious pace, began emergency consultations. Delegates from multiple countries expressed readiness to support Burkina Faso's position. One diplomat was quoted off record. If we don't act now, we send a message that African dignity is negotiable. But with that growing unity came a different kind of pressure, the quiet pressure of global systems that are not designed to accommodate defiance. International financial institutions began to watch closely. Investors expressed concern about Burkina Faso's direction. Some warned that over-politicization of diplomacy might destabilize investor confidence. A few European embassies requested private meetings with Traore's advisors, asking whether the country would take further actions if no apology arrived. None of them said the word sanctions. But everyone felt it in the room. The risk wasn't just diplomatic isolation. It was economic retaliation, the kind that comes slowly in the form of stalled agreements, withheld loans, shifting trade terms. Yet for many Africans, these weren't deterrents. They were proof of the double standard. Why is it, they asked, that when African leaders speak boldly, they are seen as threats, but when others speak just as boldly, they are called statesmen? In a Nairobi news broadcast, a respected journalist asked plainly, if standing up for your country's dignity makes you a risk, what does staying silent make you? That question echoed far beyond politics. In community meetings across West Africa, in churches and mosques, among business leaders and teachers, people began to ask themselves, what does respect really mean, and who gets to define it? And that's when the ultimatum began to shift from an event into a principle. It was no longer just about Israel's words. It was about the world's reaction, or lack of one. And that silence became deafening. But it also became clarifying. Because in the absence of an apology, the continent found something even more valuable: a common ground. Religious leaders who had never appeared at the same table signed joint declarations. Artists and musicians turned Traore's speech into soundtracks. Even opposition leaders in African parliaments, often divided along ideological lines, acknowledged that the ultimatum had touched something real. It wasn't political theater. It was a moral stance. And that made all the difference. In Burkina Faso, even communities hit hardest by conflict found a moment of unity. Local leaders reported stories of villagers gathered around radios, listening to international coverage of the speech. Teachers asked students to write reflections on the meaning of sovereignty. Families displaced by violence whispered the words of the ultimatum like a mantra, not because they believed it would change the world overnight, but because for once the world was watching them and listening. And if there's one thing history has taught us, it's this: when silence is no longer safe speech, becomes a form of survival. And when dignity is no longer guaranteed, unity becomes a form of resistance. It started as a speech. But by the end of 48 hours, it had become something much larger, a shift in how Africa sees itself and how it demands to be seen. President Ibrahim Traore's ultimatum did not come with tanks or economic ultimatums. There was no embargo, no severing of ties, no dramatic recall of ambassadors. What he issued was harder to dismiss and even harder to reverse a new expectation. An expectation that respect is not a diplomatic courtesy, it is a prerequisite. For decades, African diplomacy has lived in a space of polite negotiation, quiet frustrations, long meetings, delayed promises. Even when African nations were disrespected or sidelined, the response was often muted, calculated to maintain aid trade and geopolitical alliances. But what Traore did in Addis Ababa was challenge that entire paradigm. He refused to treat diplomacy as performance. He treated it as principle. That shift, from cautious to clear, from polite to principled, may be the most significant diplomatic development on the continent in a generation. And the question it raised echoed far beyond Burkina Faso. What would happen if other African nations did the same? Already the early tremors are being felt. In regional blocs like ECOWAS and the African Union, conversations have turned from economics to ethics. Some member states are considering protocols that tie future trade and diplomatic agreements to standards of mutual respect, not just resource exchange. This represents a quiet revolution moving from reactive foreign policy to value-based diplomacy. For a continent so often labeled as a recipient, Traore's stance repositions Africa as an active player, not just in crisis, not just in conflict, but in defining the very terms of engagement. And there's another dimension: generational psychology. Across Africa, young people, the majority demographic, are not looking for more promises. They're looking for posture, for presence, for a leadership style that reflects their reality: bold, global, unafraid. Traore, at just 36 years old, became a lightning rod for this sentiment, not because he is flawless, no leader is, but because he broke a mold. He spoke without the pre-approved language of think tanks and global consultancies. He spoke like someone who grew up on the same soil, drank the same water, and now stood before the world refusing to filter his truth. This matters, because symbolism in politics isn't just pageantry, it's instruction. When a leader speaks boldly, it gives others permission to rethink what's possible. And when that boldness is tied to concrete reforms, like nationalizing mining sectors, building domestic refineries, and promoting agricultural self-sufficiency, it moves from rhetoric to roadmap. Strategically, the ultimatum also did something else. It exposed how deeply unequal the global system still is, and how fragile that imbalance becomes when one voice steps out of line. Notice how quickly the financial concerns surfaced, how cautiously international organizations began to issue statements, how certain embassies moved from friendly dialogue to quiet anxiety. This is not coincidence, it's conditioning. The world has grown accustomed to an Africa that is cooperative, flexible, sometimes even deferential, but rarely confrontational. When that dynamic is flipped even slightly, the machinery of international diplomacy stutters. And yet, what Traore revealed is that the cost of silence may in the long run be far higher than the cost of defiance, because silence breeds dependency, but clarity breeds alignment. And alignment among African nations within the diaspora between generations is the key to lasting strategic power. That's the long game. If African countries align not just on trade, but on principles, if civil society holds leaders accountable for demanding respect abroad, as well as reforms at home, if regional institutions stop chasing foreign validation and start enforcing continental values, then what began as a 48-hour countdown becomes a lasting shift. Not just in Africa's place in the world, but in how the world is allowed to treat Africa. This doesn't mean conflict. It doesn't mean isolation. It means a new kind of diplomacy, one that insists that dignity isn't earned through wealth or weapons, but through unwavering self-respect. That's what makes the ultimatum historic. Not whether Netanyahu apologized, but that Africa no longer whispered its pain. It spoke. And when it did, the world had to listen. This is not a call for division. This is a call for recognition. Africa is not demanding the impossible. It is asking for what every nation deserves: to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. When President Ibrahim Traore stood before the world, he did not threaten. He did not posture. He reminded us quietly, firmly, that dignity is not negotiable. And for once, the world didn't look away. Now the question falls to each of us, to the citizens of Africa. Will we carry this moment beyond the headlines into our classrooms, our parliaments, our communities? Will we demand from our leaders the same courage we saw in Addis Ababa? To the diaspora, will we lift our voices not just in celebration, but in strategy? Will we connect this moment to generations of resistance and legacy? To the world, will you treat Africa as an equal partner? Not just in resources, but in responsibility. Because history is not written by those who wait. It is written by those who stand. And on that morning, Ibrahim Traore stood not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent. If you've ever believed in justice, if you've ever questioned the silence of powerful nations, if you've ever hoped for a world where respect isn't rationed, then remember this moment. Share it, teach it, carry it forward, because Africa will not be a whisper. It will be a voice, and that voice is rising.